Imagine sitting at your own dining table, kids asleep upstairs, and everything around you suddenly feeling wrong. It's a feeling you can't shake. That was me, sitting there in the quiet, knowing something was off. I was finishing a late-night snack when I noticed a credit card receipt tucked halfway under the bread box. Nothing unusual about that, except I knew I hadn't used the card for weeks, and Sarah, my wife, was supposed to be away on a work trip with her team. Curious, I slid the receipt out and read it over. It was from a fancy Italian restaurant downtown, a place we'd both joked about trying but had never quite gotten around to because it wasn't exactly family-friendly. The date was last Saturday night, and it wasn't just dinner, it was a full-on multi-course meal with wine, dessert, and one other detail that hit me hard: it was a table for two. Something inside me turned cold. I could feel my pulse drumming in my ears, but I tried to play it off. Maybe she'd just gone with a colleague. It didn't have to mean anything, right? But then I thought back to the way she'd been acting. Sarah had always been a social butterfly, sure, but recently, it felt like her focus had shifted. I'd brushed it off as job stress or the usual exhaustion from managing the kids and work, but now, staring at that receipt, I felt a kind of paranoia creep in. Unable to shake it, I headed up to our bedroom. She'd left her planner on her bedside table, a thick leather-bound book she guarded religiously. Sarah never let it out of her sight, always calling it her lifeline for keeping things in order. That planner was practically sacred in her eyes, and something about that made me want to open it, just for a peek. When I opened Sarah's planner, I expected to find her usual list of work tasks, grocery notes, maybe reminders about the kids' school events. But what I saw instead felt like a punch to the gut. There, in her neat handwriting, was a series of appointments marked with simple initials, JM. And alongside each one was a date and time. My first thought was that it might be a client, but as I scanned down the list, I noticed something disturbing. There were no work-related notes around these appointments. No mention of meetings, office tasks, or anything else. And these appointments weren't at normal work hours either. They were in the evenings and on weekends, even times she'd claimed to be with her family or out with her friends. All those times she'd explained she was running late from work, I'd let it slide, told myself it was just her career demanding more of her. Now I was starting to feel like a fool. The planner seemed to hold all these secrets in plain sight, hidden from me until now. It was shocking how blatant it was. How little effort it took to uncover a timeline that I should have been aware of if I'd only looked closer. The earliest JM entry was about 3 months back, on a Friday night when she'd said she'd had a team outing. I remembered it well because she'd come home around 1 a.m., claiming the team had hit a few bars after dinner. I'd laughed it off back then, thought she'd just let loose for once. I hadn't even thought to question it. My hands were shaking, but I kept flipping through the pages. Another entry for JM stood out: last Tuesday, a day when she texted me she was stuck in traffic. The traffic story was so casual, so ordinary, that I hadn't thought twice. I'd even offered to bring the kids over to her parents' place for dinner so she wouldn't have to rush home. That memory made me sick now. She'd told me to go without her, saying she'd grab a quick bite somewhere and come home. It was like she'd been operating right under my nose, keeping her secrets with almost no effort. I wanted to believe it was just a friend or colleague. I wanted to cling to some thread of innocence in all this, but the way she'd gone to lengths to hide it from me suggested something else. I needed more proof. I needed to be sure before I confronted her. My mind was racing, but I was determined to stay rational. There had to be a way to catch her without her realizing I was onto her. I turned the page and saw something I didn't expect. It was a receipt from a local motel, folded in half, marking a random Tuesday in her planner. My blood went cold. Sarah and I had never stayed at a motel together in our lives. We had no need for places like that. This wasn't just a restaurant dinner, this was something she'd actively hidden, a place where she'd spent time with someone else. I checked the date on the receipt: 2 weeks ago, right in the middle of the day. She'd told me she was at a training seminar. She'd even called me during lunch, saying she missed me and the kids, that the training was dull and dragging on forever. That casual lie burned into my mind as I read over the details on the receipt. The timestamp was right after lunch, the same day she'd called to tell me she'd be home late. I put the receipt back and closed the planner, feeling a wave of nausea. I needed time to think, to pull myself together and figure out what this meant. My wife of 10 years, the mother of my children, was sneaking around with some guy whose initials she'd scribbled into her planner without a second thought. I couldn't believe this was the same woman who'd looked me in the eyes, promising she'd never hide anything from me. I felt an anger building inside me that I didn't know I was capable of feeling. I went downstairs, pouring myself a glass of water just to have something to do, something to ground myself in reality. My mind raced through every interaction we'd had over the last few months, every suspicious moment I'd brushed off, every night she'd come home late without an explanation that made sense. I thought about her birthday last month, the way she'd seemed distant, glued to her phone when we were supposed to be celebrating. She'd gotten upset when I'd questioned her, saying she'd had a hard week at work. I'd taken her word for it, let her off the hook because I wanted to believe there was a good reason. As I sat there, it became clear I needed to know who this JM was. If I was going to confront Sarah, I wanted to be armed with facts, not just suspicions. I went to our desktop computer, logged into our shared phone plan account, and pulled up the call history. My heart pounded as I searched for any pattern of phone calls that stood out. And there it was, a number that showed up frequently, mostly in the evenings when Sarah said she was at work events or meeting friends. I jotted the number down, mentally bracing myself as I looked it up online. After a few searches, I found it registered to a guy named Jason Mitchell. I didn't recognize the name, but it felt like a puzzle piece sliding into place. I clicked through some social media profiles, finally finding one that seemed to match. Jason Mitchell, age 34, works as a project manager for some tech firm downtown. No family photos, just selfies and a few pictures at various bars around town, grinning at the camera with friends. He looked younger than me by a few years, a bit more stylish, the kind of guy who probably knew his way around the nightlife scene in a way I never had. Sitting there, staring at his picture, I couldn't figure out what my next move was supposed to be. This wasn't just some misunderstanding I could talk through with Sarah. This was deliberate, premeditated. She'd gone to lengths to lie to me, to put up a facade and then slip away to meet this guy whenever it suited her. The motel, the dinners, the secrecy, it all painted a picture I didn't want to see, but couldn't deny any longer. I thought about the kids sleeping upstairs, the life we'd built together, and felt a mix of anger, hurt, and betrayal. I couldn't just let this slide, couldn't pretend that everything was fine. I knew confronting her in the heat of my emotions wouldn't end well. I needed a plan. There was no way I'd let her lie her way out of this. Not after what I'd seen. I sat back, feeling strangely calm as I mapped it out. I'd confront her, but not yet. Not until I had more, not until I knew I'd corner her with undeniable proof. I'd follow up on Jason, find out where he worked, maybe even catch them together if I had to. I wasn't about to let her drag me along in the dark any longer. This was my life, and I'd be damned if I let her keep the upper hand. The next morning, Sarah walked into the kitchen, gave me a peck on the cheek, and asked how I'd slept. I looked her in the eyes and forced to smile, pretending everything was normal. For now, I'd play the game, keep things calm. But inside, I'd already made up my mind. I spent the next couple of days holding myself together. I knew I'd have to confront Sarah soon, but I wanted it to be on my terms. I wanted her to walk into the conversation with no idea what was coming, so she couldn't spin up her lies in advance. Every night, I watched her act like everything was fine, like our marriage was untouched, even as I saw the text alerts on her phone, the too frequent late-night work messages, all the little details I hadn't paid attention to before. Now, I couldn't ignore them. By Thursday night, I couldn't keep up the charade any longer. Sarah had just finished getting ready for another work dinner and came downstairs in a dress she'd normally save for a real night out. I watched her put on lipstick in the hallway mirror, checking herself from every angle. It was almost laughable, the way she acted like I couldn't see right through it now. She noticed me watching and smiled, oblivious to what was coming. "Big meeting tonight?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She turned, a little surprised I'd said anything. "Yeah. You know, clients from out of town. They're important to the firm, so I might be late. Don't wait up." She flashed a quick smile and started for the door. "Actually, I was hoping you'd have a minute, I said, stepping in front of her. I think we should talk. She paused, her hand still on the doorknob. Talk about what? I really have to go. Then you'll want to sit down, I replied, motioning to the living room. She looked frustrated but didn't argue. She followed me into the living room and sat on the couch, crossing her arms. I could see the impatience in her eyes, as if I was just some inconvenience standing between her and whatever plans she had with Jason Mitchell tonight. I pulled her planner from the side table and held it up. Her face went pale the second she recognized it. She sat there, silent, her lips pressed together as she waited for me to start. So, who's JM? I asked, watching her reaction. She didn't say anything right away. Her eyes darted to the planner, then back to me. It's just a colleague. Jason Mitchell. We work together sometimes. Her voice was calm, practiced, like she'd rehearsed it in her head 100 times. Right, Jason Mitchell, I replied. Same Jason Mitchell you've been sneaking off to meet at random motels? The color drained from her face. I could see the mental gears turning, her brain scrambling to catch up. But her mouth didn't seem to cooperate. It's not what it looks like, Dan. Oh, really? I kept my tone neutral, letting her think she might still have a way out. Because I have to admit, from where I'm standing, it looks pretty straightforward. You've been sneaking around behind my back, seeing this guy, lying about work trips and dinner meetings, all to meet up with him in hotel rooms. So, tell me how it's not what it looks like. Her eyes went wide, and for a second, she looked scared. Then, as if on cue, the tears started. She leaned forward, burying her face in her hands, and I felt an overwhelming disgust, not sympathy, not even pity. Just disgust. The way she cried felt hollow, like she knew it was supposed to be emotional, but I didn't believe it for a second. I'm sorry, she whispered. It was a mistake, Dan. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Then how far did you mean for it to go? I shot back. Did you plan to sneak around until you got bored? Or were you just waiting for me to find out? She shook her head, wiping at her eyes. I don't know. I don't know how it happened. He's just different, you know? I don't know why I did it. I stared at her, letting her see the anger that I'd held back until now. Different? That's what you're going with? You've been lying to my face, lying to our kids, sneaking around with this guy, all because he's different? She flinched, as if the words hurt, but I didn't care. She opened her mouth to say something, then stopped. It was clear she didn't have an answer, so she went for the only card she had left. Dan, please, it doesn't have to be like this. We can work through it. We can go to counseling or something. I'll stop seeing him, I promise. I almost laughed at the desperation in her voice. You think I'm going to believe that? You think you can just turn off whatever it is you've got with him, just like that? Because let me tell you, I don't buy it. Dan, please, she reached out, but I pulled back. I didn't want her anywhere near me. No, Sarah, I said, standing up. You don't get to please me. Not after what you've done. For a second, a flash of anger crossed her face. So what? You just want to end it, just like that? Throw away everything we've built? Don't act like you're the victim here, I shot back. I'm not the one sneaking off to motels with someone else. You made your choice, and I'm making mine. She went silent, her expression hardening. The fake tears, the pleas, they were gone. I could see her mind shifting, calculating. Fine. If that's what you want. That's what I want, I said, coldly. But first, you're going to pack your things and get out of this house. You don't get to stay here, pretending nothing happened. Her jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought she might argue. But then she nodded, and without another word, she stood up and went upstairs. I watched her go, feeling nothing but anger and relief. I'd expected this confrontation to be painful, to dredge up every good memory we'd shared, every moment that might have made me hesitate. But there was nothing. Just emptiness. She came down a few minutes later, a small bag slung over her shoulder. She didn't meet my eyes as she walked past, her face blank, a mask of indifference. At the door, she paused, looking back as if she wanted to say something, but I turned away before she could. The door clicked shut, and for the first time in months, the house was silent. I stood there, taking it in, letting the anger simmer down. The weight of everything was still there, but somehow, the air felt cleaner, less stifling. I'd been dreading this confrontation, expecting it to tear me apart, but all I felt was a strange, cold satisfaction. Upstairs, I found her planner still lying on the coffee table, the evidence of her lies out in the open. I picked it up, flipped through it one last time, then tossed it into the trash. The anger hadn't disappeared, but it was muted now, a steady pulse under the surface. I knew this was just the beginning, that there would be fallout, explanations to the kids, the legal process to deal with. But at least I'd faced her, cut through the lies, and taken the first step. For now, that was enough. After Sarah left, the house was quiet, almost eerily so. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, going over the confrontation in my head. I couldn't stop picturing her face, that panicked look when I called her out. It was satisfying, but only for a moment. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that her walking out with nothing but a bag wasn't enough. She'd blown up our marriage, lied to my face for months, taken advantage of my trust. There had to be consequences. The first thing I did was call our bank and lock down all our accounts. We'd been sharing everything financially, and I wasn't about to let her start draining funds while she was out there figuring things out. I took her off as a joint account holder, canceled the credit card she had access to, and notified my financial advisor to make sure she couldn't touch a single dollar. Every cent in our accounts was earned together, and I'd be damned if I let her use it to keep up her affair. Next, I tackled the house. This home wasn't just a piece of property, it was our kids' stability, their one place of consistency, and I wasn't about to let her mess with that either. I'd inherited the house from my parents, so technically, it was in my name alone. It was something I'd never thought much about during our marriage, but now, that detail felt crucial. I called my lawyer, making sure that as we moved forward with divorce proceedings, she couldn't make a claim on it. The kids and I would stay here, while she would have to find someplace else to land. Let her try explaining that to her new guy, Jason. Once that was handled, I started thinking about Jason. She might have walked out, but I wasn't done with her yet. I wanted them both to feel the sting of what they'd done. I wanted to make sure neither of them walked away from this clean. So, I did something I never thought I'd do. I hired a private investigator. My goal was to gather evidence, something concrete to use in the divorce proceedings, to make sure she didn't get away with a dime more than she deserved. The investigator was a guy I'd been put in touch with through a friend. No nonsense, very straightforward. I told him everything, shared what I'd found so far, and he assured me he could get whatever I needed to make my case airtight. It wasn't cheap, but at that point, I didn't care. I'd saved for years to build a future with Sarah, and if she wanted to burn it all down, she'd pay the price. While the investigator went to work, I focused on letting people know what was really going on. Over the years, Sarah and I had built a close-knit social circle, friends from work, our kids' school friends' parents, people we'd known for years. They were all people who'd seen us as this stable, happy couple, who trusted us. I wasn't going to hide the truth from them. She was the one who'd broken that trust, not me. I called up a few of our mutual friends, people who'd been around long enough to see us go from newlyweds to parents. I told them everything. It wasn't some drama I wanted to spread out of pettiness, it was about setting the record straight. I wasn't interested in her story or any excuses she might have given them down the line. I wanted them to hear it from me. I could hear the shock, the awkward silences on the other end, but I didn't care. They could take it however they wanted. I wasn't covering for her anymore. One of our close friends, Tom, who'd known us since college, was speechless. Dan. I can't believe it. You guys were the couple everyone thought would make it. Yeah, well, I replied, everyone was wrong. The more I shared, the more I realized how many lies she'd told over the months. One friend mentioned she'd talked about work trips she needed to take that didn't add up with what I knew. Another friend said she'd missed several dinners and gatherings recently, always claiming she had work emergencies. Every new detail they shared confirmed what I'd suspected: she'd been building this affair right under my nose, and nobody had questioned it. After that, I started thinking about her family. Her parents, her siblings, they all knew us as a stable couple, probably thought the same as our friends did. But they didn't know their perfect daughter had been lying to me, to her kids, to everyone. They'd never suspected a thing, never imagined she'd be capable of something like this. It was time they learned the truth, too. I wrote a long email, detailing everything. I told them how I discovered her affair, how she'd been hiding it for months, and how I'd confronted her. I explained that we'd be moving forward with a divorce and that I wasn't going to let her paint herself as the victim in this story. I didn't hold back. They needed to know that she wasn't the person they thought she was, and I wasn't going to let her twist things in her favor. I hit send, feeling a strange sense of satisfaction. It felt final, like I'd taken the power back, claimed control over the narrative that she thought she'd handle herself. The next day, the investigator called me. He'd managed to get into Jason's social media, found some interesting details. He shared that Jason wasn't just some random guy, he was married, too, with 2 young kids. His wife had no idea. I hadn't anticipated this twist, but I knew instantly what I'd do with that information. This guy, Jason, had been playing the same game as Sarah, lying to his family, sneaking around with my wife. If he thought he'd walk away from this without consequences, he had another thing coming. I looked up Jason's wife's information, which the investigator had managed to find. Her name was Megan, and I had her phone number and email. I didn't wait. I sent her a message, plain and direct. Hi Megan, my name is Dan. You don't know me, but I'm the husband of Sarah, the woman Jason has been seeing behind your back. I thought you'd want to know the truth about what's been going on. Within minutes, she replied. Is this some kind of sick joke? I assured her it wasn't, attached a few screenshots of text conversations between Sarah and Jason that the investigator had dug up. They were explicit, full of plans to meet up, to keep things hidden. I sent those over and waited. I didn't know how she'd react, and frankly, I didn't care. She deserved to know the truth, just like I had. Later that evening, Megan called. Her voice was shaky, and I could tell she was barely holding it together. Dan, thank you for telling me. I don't know what to do. You don't owe me anything, I replied. But at least now you know. You can decide what to do from here. By the time I hung up, I felt a strange calm. It wasn't satisfaction exactly, but a sense of balance. For once, I felt like I'd evened the score, given them a taste of the mess they'd created. Over the next few days, I started seeing signs that my actions were hitting home. Sarah tried calling me multiple times, leaving voicemails asking to talk things through or find a way to work it out. I ignored every single one of them. She had her chance to be honest, and she threw it away. She could deal with the fallout on her own. By the end of the week, I heard through a friend that Jason's wife had kicked him out. Rumor had it she was pushing for full custody of the kids. I didn't feel sorry for him or Sarah. They'd made their choices, and now they were living with them. Finally, I sat down with my lawyer, going over the divorce paperwork. I wanted full custody of our kids, the house, and a clear line drawn in the sand. Sarah wouldn't get a cent more than she legally had coming. I'd see to it that this divorce would leave her with no illusions about getting a fresh start with Jason. After the week I'd had, I knew the inevitable was coming. I could avoid Sarah's calls, delete her messages, block her on every social media platform, but at some point, we'd need to have a final conversation. We had the kids to consider, and whether I wanted to see her or not, I knew we'd have to confront the mess she'd made one last time. When I finally picked up her call, her voice came through the line tense, almost pleading. Dan, can we talk? I agreed, but only on my terms. I wasn't about to let her waltz into the house or meet at some neutral cafe where she could play the wounded partner for strangers. I told her to come by Saturday morning, after I'd arranged for the kids to stay at my parents' house for the weekend. I didn't want them anywhere near the confrontation that was coming. She showed up on time, looking tired, her usual polished appearance stripped away. She wore no makeup, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Her face was pale, and there was a shadow under her eyes that told me she hadn't been sleeping well. Somehow, the sight of her looking so vulnerable didn't soften me. If anything, it only hardened my resolve. She'd done this to herself. "Thanks for talking," she started, looking down at her hands instead of at me. "Let's just get this over with," I replied, refusing to sit down. "What do you want, Sarah?" She swallowed, then looked up, meeting my eyes for the first time. "Dan, I know you're angry. I know I hurt you. But this doesn't have to be the end. We can go to counseling. I'm willing to put in the work if you are. We can get through this, for the kids, for us." The audacity of it nearly made me laugh. After everything, after the months of lies and sneaking around, she thought she could just wave it away with promises of counseling and commitment? "You're kidding, right?" I asked, my voice coming out sharper than I'd intended. "You really think we can just, what? Patch this up?" She flinched but held her ground. "Dan, I was wrong. I know I was. I've thought about nothing else since I left. I don't know why I did it. I got lost somewhere along the way. But that doesn't change what we have together. What we had, Sarah." Past tense, I corrected, keeping my voice flat. "Because what we had was built on trust, and you've shattered that." She took a deep breath, clearly trying to hold it together. "I know it doesn't make sense to you. I know it's hard to understand, but I never stopped loving you. This, with Jason, it was stupid, a mistake I'd take back if I could. You have to believe me." I shook my head. "I don't have to believe anything. I've already heard enough of your lies. You say it was a mistake? That's rich, Sarah. A mistake is something that happens once. This was months of lies, of planning, of sneaking around. A mistake is forgetting an anniversary or saying something you don't mean. What you did was calculated, deliberate." She looked desperate now, searching for words. "Dan, please, don't make this harder than it has to be. I made a mistake, and I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you let me." I laughed, a cold, bitter sound that echoed through the empty house. "You're not getting it, Sarah. I don't want you to make it up to me. I don't want anything from you. You've shown me exactly who you are, and I believe you." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't soften. She could cry all she wanted, I wasn't about to give her an inch. "So that's it?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You're just done with us?" "I'm done with you," I replied, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over me. "Our marriage is over, Sarah. I'll make sure the kids are okay, but there's nothing left for you and me to fix." She sat back, her shoulders slumping as the reality set in. "And what about the kids?" she asked, her tone shifting from pleading to angry. "You think you can just take them and pretend I don't exist?" "The kids are staying with me," I replied, my voice steady. "You don't get to play the doting mother card now. You've made it clear where your priorities lie. They need stability, not whatever chaos you've been living in." Her eyes flared, and she leaned forward, her face flushed with anger. "Don't you dare question my love for them. I am still their mother. I've made mistakes, but that doesn't give you the right to take them from me." "Then you should have thought about that before you decided to lead a double life," I shot back. "Because I'm not going to let you put them through this any more than you already have." She went silent, the anger draining from her face, replaced by something closer to despair. She looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "Dan, please, don't do this. We can work something out." "There's nothing to work out," I replied, crossing my arms. "You've broken every promise, every commitment we ever made to each other. I'm not going to pretend we can go back to the way things were." She let out a shaky breath, a defeated look settling on her face. I thought we could start over. That maybe you could forgive me." I almost felt sorry for her, seeing her like this. Almost. But then I remembered everything I'd gone through in the past weeks, the lies she'd fed me, the months she'd spent betraying everything we'd built. Any sympathy I might have felt vanished. "I don't think you understand what you've done," I said, my voice calm but firm. "There's no starting over. Not with you." A heavy silence settled between us. She looked away, wiping at her eyes. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "So that's it, then?" "That's it," I replied. "You'll get a lawyer, I'll get mine. We'll settle this civilly, but don't expect me to be generous. You've already taken more than enough from me." She nodded, a small, defeated motion. "Can I at least see the kids?" "You'll see them," I replied. "But not until I feel it's right. You've put them through enough already. They need stability, Sarah. They don't need you coming and going, dragging them through your mess." She winced but didn't argue. "I guess that's fair," she said, her voice hollow. She looked at me one last time, as if hoping I might change my mind. "Goodbye, Dan." "Goodbye, Sarah," I replied, feeling a finality in those words I hadn't expected. She stood up, hesitating for a moment before turning and walking toward the door. I watched her go, not moving, not saying another word. She opened the door, paused, and then stepped outside, closing it quietly behind her. The second she was gone, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. This was it, the end of the chapter that had consumed my life for the past 10 years. I'd done everything I could, fought to hold on to the life I'd thought we were building together, only to watch her destroy it piece by piece. But now, finally, I could move on. I sat down, feeling a strange, quiet sense of peace. I knew the path forward wouldn't be easy. There would be tough conversations with the kids, long hours spent with lawyers, probably more arguments with Sarah before it was all over. But in that moment, none of it mattered. The hard part was done. I'd faced her, laid it all out, and closed the door on that part of my life. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. In the days following Sarah's final departure, life began to take on a different kind of rhythm. The tension in the house dissipated, replaced by a calmness I hadn't felt in years. The kids came home from my parents' place, and I explained to them, as gently as I could, that their mother and I would no longer be together. I dreaded this conversation, but to my surprise, they handled it better than I expected. They asked questions, sure, but they accepted it with the resilient maturity only kids seem to have. Once we'd settled into the reality of our new routine, I focused on putting the pieces of my life back together. The divorce proceedings moved forward, and I stayed in regular contact with my lawyer to ensure things went smoothly. Sarah had tried to negotiate, arguing for what was fair, but I kept it blunt. She would leave with exactly what she came into this marriage with and nothing more. My lawyer had all the evidence I'd gathered, receipts, call logs, and the investigator's detailed report on her affair with Jason. It was all lined up, ready to make my case ironclad if she tried to fight for more. She must have realized it was pointless. In the end, Sarah agreed to the terms without a fight. We divided up our belongings, the cars, and she signed off on my full custody of the kids. She knew she had no ground to stand on. It was the kind of ending I hadn't expected when this nightmare started to clean, decisive, with no room for misunderstandings or drawn-out arguments. My friends and family rallied around me, offering support in ways I hadn't anticipated. I kept the betrayal under wraps for as long as I could, but once the divorce became official, people started piecing things together. Tom, the friend who'd known Sarah and me since college, dropped by one evening with a six-pack and a sympathetic ear. "You're holding up better than I expected, man," he said as we sat on the back porch, staring out into the yard. "A lot of guys would be a wreck after what you've been through." "I don't feel like I have much of a choice," I replied, taking a sip from my bottle. "I can't afford to break down, not with the kids depending on me. They need me to be strong right now." Tom nodded, but there was a question lingering in his eyes. "So, do you think you'll ever forgive her? For your own peace, I mean." The question lingered between us, and I had to think about it. Forgiveness was a concept people talked about easily, but it wasn't something I'd even considered. "I don't think so," I said finally. "Forgiving her wouldn't change anything. She made her choices, and I'm making mine. I don't see the point in pretending everything's fine just to give her a clean slate in my head. I'm just done." Tom didn't press me. He seemed to understand that there were no words of wisdom that would make any of this easier. He was just there, a friend willing to sit with me in the aftermath of everything, and that was enough. The next few months were all about rebuilding a life I could call my own. I focused on routines, on making sure the kids adjusted, and on keeping my own emotions in check. The house was ours now, and slowly, I found ways to make it feel like a fresh start instead of a reminder of what I'd lost. I cleared out all the little remnants Sarah had left behind, her perfume on the bathroom shelf, the framed photos of us on the living room wall. I replaced them with pictures of just me and the kids, memories of happy times that didn't carry the weight of betrayal. Life fell into place, but not without a few unexpected bumps along the way. There were nights when I felt the weight of everything settle in, when the quiet of the house after the kids went to bed felt too loud, too empty. Those were the moments when doubt crept in, when I questioned every choice I'd made, every moment I'd overlooked in our marriage. But I pushed through those feelings, reminded myself that looking back wouldn't change anything. One afternoon, about 6 months after Sarah had left, I ran into Jason's wife, Megan, at a local coffee shop. She looked different, more composed, with a determination in her eyes that hadn't been there when I'd last spoken to her. We made small talk, catching up in that polite, strained way people do after going through something heavy together. "I'm sorry for everything you went through," she said finally, her voice soft. "I know this, all of it, it couldn't have been easy." "It wasn't," I replied, choosing my words carefully. "But I think, in the end, it's been better. I'm moving forward, and I'm doing it on my own terms." "That's more than I could have said a year ago." She nodded, looking down at her coffee, and for a moment, I saw a reflection of my own journey in her expression. We didn't have to explain it to each other, the loss, the anger, the long nights of wondering how things had gone so wrong. We both understood the weight of betrayal and the determination it took to build a new life from the rubble. Eventually, she looked up, giving me a small, sad smile. "Well, here's to better days." "Better days," I agreed, lifting my coffee cup. After she left, I felt a sense of closure I hadn't anticipated. It was like we'd both come full circle, each of us moving on in our own way, ready to leave the past behind without the need for vengeance or lingering anger. By the time the divorce was officially finalized, I developed a sense of peace. There was no going back, and I'd come to terms with that. I was building a new life, one where my focus was on my kids, on creating stability and joy without the shadow of Sarah's betrayal hanging over us. I'd found routines that brought comfort, hobbies I'd long neglected, and, most importantly, a renewed sense of identity that had nothing to do with being Sarah's husband. On the day I received the final paperwork, I took the kids out to celebrate not the divorce itself, but the beginning of a new chapter. We went to their favorite restaurant, ordered way too much food, and laughed together in a way I hadn't laughed in a long time. For the first time, I felt a genuine happiness, a release from the weight that had been pressing down on me for months. When I put the kids to bed that night, Emma, my oldest, looked up at me with a serious expression. "Dad, are you happy now?" The question took me by surprise, but I smiled, nodding. "Yeah, Emma. I think I am." She seemed satisfied with that, giving me a hug before curling up under her blankets. Watching her drift off to sleep, I realized that happiness didn't come from trying to fix a broken marriage or forcing forgiveness. It came from letting go of the things that didn't serve me, from accepting the reality and finding the strength to move forward. In the quiet that followed, I thought about everything I'd learned from the experience. It was a hard lesson, one that had left its mark, but it had taught me the value of trust, honesty, and resilience. I'd faced betrayal head-on, wrestled with anger, and come out the other side stronger, more determined to create a life that was genuine and fulfilling. The next morning, I started planning a trip with the kids. Nothing extravagant, just a weekend getaway to the mountains, a chance for us to create new memories together, ones untainted by the past. As I booked the cabin, I felt a rush of excitement, a feeling I hadn't experienced in a long time. This wasn't about escaping, it was about moving forward, embracing the life we had, and building something new, something real. In the end, I didn't look back. Sarah became a memory, a chapter that had closed, and I carried forward only the lessons I'd learned, determined to make the future brighter for me and my kids. For the first time in years, I felt free to be myself, free to create the life I wanted, and free to find happiness on my own terms. And that, I realized, was the best revenge of all.